The chapter that I was assigned for this project was chapter 15, and it was called African American Students and Other Students of Color in Special Education. In this chapter, what was discussed was 6 main topics. The first one is the original purpose of the American educational system. Then there's the current context of African American and other students of color in the American educational system, the original purpose of special education, and a historical account of the problem of disproportionate placement of African American and other students of color in special education, what we know about disproportionality in years of educational equity, and what is needed to continue the fight to eradicate the disproportionate placement of African American and other students of color, particularly those in urban settings in special education. So I will be going more in depth on these 6 topics throughout this presentation. The first section that was talked about was the original purpose of the American education system. So, education was designed for the purpose of serving the dual role of controlling and sorting children deemed problematic and undesirable by society. Thomas Jefferson, who was the president at the time, thought about a 2-track system, one for the laborers and one for the learned. So already this education was being segregated into 2 different systems. So this allowed for minimal removal from the lower class to the upper class because of the way that it was segregated. In 1851, the first law passed, and it ensured that children of poor immigrants get civilized and learn obedience and restraint so that they make good workers and don't contribute to social upheaval. So even back then, when school had first started, it wasn't about education or becoming smarter and learning new skills and math and stuff like that. It was just basically to keep an eye on the low poverty and stuff like that. And so schools were always against the African American students, and in 1896 with Plessy versus Ferguson, the law authorized the notion of separate but equal, legitimized segregation in the U.S. society, and allowed for continued segregation of African American students in the public. So obviously we've all heard about separate but equal, and we all know that separate is not equal. There was discrimination and racism in schools and schooling, and children were just not together. In this chapter, Joel Springs named 3 purposes of schooling, the first being the political goal of educating future citizens to participate in a democratic republic, the social goal of controlling the behaviors of the masses, and third, the economic goal of socializing workers in industry. None of these goals had anything to do with education of the students and looking over their well-being. It was all for the selfish reasonings. The next section that was covered was the African American students and other students of color in the American education system. This section was a little bit shorter than the others, but it had to do with low retention and graduation rates of African American and other students of colors compared to white students. In high schools where African American students constituted more than 50%, 67% of those African American students, their high schools were considered low retention, which means less people or less students coming back year after year. Meanwhile, 39% of high schools with 50% or more white students, so more white students than students of color, reportedly retained 91 to 150% of students. So that is a much greater retention rate than schools with students of color. And also this section talked about African American schools were almost always considered low performing, and this had a lot to do with just assuming because they are students of color that they automatically were less inclined and less smart than white students. Now we will be going over the original purpose of special education in the American system. So at first there was the establishment made in 1975 by the All Handicapped Children Act, but this was later renamed into IDEA, or Individuals with Disabilities Education Improvement Act. So when this law or act was initially made, special education was made to provide support and training for students who were seen as a challenge for the general education classroom. So this included African American students and other students of color, students with disabilities, and students impacted by the intersection of race, ethnicity, and disability. So in these special education classrooms, what they would receive is individualized instructions and tutoring, along with other forms of intervention. But once the student their needs were met, they would then return to the general education classroom. So they would not be staying in the special education classroom for continued help. So later on, it was realized how separate these students were and how after schooling they weren't living up to their potential. They were not able to get better jobs, have the right skills for these jobs, and just have the most potential that they possibly could. And while that they were in the classroom, they didn't have any access to their non-disabled peers. So they were completely segregated from the general education classroom. So once this was found and learned about, they then started studies to examine how to increase their skills after school and how to better make them fit in and everything. And so this led to the idea of full inclusion, which is integrating the special education students with the general education students in the same classroom. Because working together, they were able to gain so much more skills than they were ever before. In this section, it talks about historical account of the problem of disproportionate placement of African American and other students of color in special education. Schools were starting to be forced to desegregate after a law had passed, and that led to an increase of children of color being entered into the special education program. The big researcher that noticed this was named Dunn, and he noticed that schools were labeling these students with mild mental retardation. It was noticed that mainly ESL students, or students who didn't know English at all, and new immigrants were the ones being labeled as mildly mentally retarded, and their white peers were not labeled at all, even though they may have shown more signs of it themselves. The work of these researchers in multiple states was the basis for Larry P. versus Riles, and this case led to the end of the use of intelligence tests as the sole basis for determining special education eligibility, and it played a role in securing some of the safeguards guaranteed by IDEA today. And it also allowed for parents to challenge their students being sent into the special education program. In one of the last sections, it talks about what we know about disproportionality in years of educational inequity. So while the special education program is far better than what it ever had been in the past, there is still lots of improvement that can be made. White children in the special education classroom do still have a better chance of being integrated in the general education classroom than students of color in the special education program. So with that being said, there is said to be 4 subsystems of public education, them being disproportionality, white, and perceived to be normal or without disabilities, disproportionately African American or color and normal or without disabilities, disproportionately white and have disabilities, and disproportionately African American and having disabilities. So there's still, with these subsystems, seems to be segregated or different sections of students and how they are in the classroom and how they fit in, or what program or what classroom that they are enabled into. And that is something that we want to see changed. So with the talk of change, this section is about that, and it is called What is Needed to Continue the Fight to Eradicate the Disproportionate Placement of African American and Other Students of Color in Special Education. Some of the things that were listed in this chapter were to continue to fight the subsystems that were previously mentioned in the slide before, own up to the failure of the education system, rethink how to prepare future educators, and combine general education teachers and special education teacher programs into one single one to better prepare everyone. The one thing that I thought, or the one mentioned that I thought was the most important, was the last one, combining the 2 programs together, because I do think that every teacher needs to have the right skill sets, because it is inevitable that we will have a student with a disability in our classroom, and we should know how to better handle them and know how to integrate everyone and how to better just help them overall. And so I think every teacher should be able to have these abilities, even if they will be going to a separate classroom during the day. At some points, they will still be in our classroom. So thank you for listening to my presentation on Chapter 15.